I'm your host, Eileen Kelly, and you're listening to the Going Mental podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by author Emmeline Clein, who just released her debut book, Dead Weight: Essays on Hunger and Harm. She received her MFA from Columbia and lives in New York. Her writing has been published in the Paris Review, the Yale Review, New York Times Magazine, the Berlin Quarterly, amongst other publications. Her chapbook, Toxic, was published by Choo Choo Press in 2022. In Dead Weight, her debut book, she recounts her struggle with disordered eating alongside the stories of other women, historical figures, pop culture celebrities, and the girls she's known and loved. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. I am a huge advocate of therapy. I have been in some form of it on and off since I was 8 years old. And there were times in my life where I didn't know if I wanted to be here. And the state of my mental health was so dire that I was literally at the point of not functioning. I am so proud of the hard work I've done in intensive therapy and how far I've come. And I just really believe that there are many things in life that are out of our control, but taking charge of your mental health does not need to be one of them. I believe that everyone can benefit from therapy, whether it's coming to terms with trauma you've been through, learning how to understand and communicate your emotions better, learning boundaries, and working on your friendships, relationships with family, romantic relationships. It's really just getting to a point where you can help build the life you want to live, and it empowers you to be the best version of yourself. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. So you just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So if you want to take charge of your mental health, visit betterhelp.com/goingmental today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/goingmental. Okay, well,
let's do
welcome
it.
to the podcast. I'm so sorry I've rescheduled on you. I got COVID.
Literally, don't apologize, Queen. I'm so happy to be here.
Let's start things off with, do you mind introducing yourself for my listeners? I always love to ask people to introduce themselves to see what they say.
Okay, I am Emmeline Clein. I'm a friend of Eileen's, first and foremost. I'm also a writer. I recently published a book called Dead Weight: Essays on Hunger and Harm. That's sort of a combination social, political, economic history of eating disorders in the US, and also a bit of memoir and some kind of pop cultural criticism.
What made you want to write about this topic in the first place?
So I had an eating disorder, or have. Its recovery is so durational and a spectrum. And it's always like kind of in the back of your mind, even when you're recovered, at least in my experience. But I first became ill with an eating disorder when I was really young, like around 12. And I didn't really find recovery through traditional treatment methods. I found that those often kind of made me sicker, which we can get into it later. But I found recovery through like truly other women, both like people in my life that talked to me honestly about it, fictional characters that I looked up to, girls that anonymously that I befriended online, so many different women. And then as I was thinking about what to write a book about when I was in grad school, I was actually thinking I should write a book about female hysteria, kind of being like, oh, what was it in the Victorian era? What is it now? Is it me? Is it Misha Barton? What's it giving? And as I started doing the research, I found that a lot of the people I was looking at, both in the Victorian era and in the modern era, had a lot of disordered eating symptoms. And then I started wondering, as part of my research for that, well, where's a book that sort of really situates eating disorders in their social, political, economic context that really like gives the sufferers of these diseases that are so prevalent and so lethal, like a really like intellectually layered treatment, the kind of nonfiction treatment that any other disease that doesn't primarily afflict women often gets. So like you see the alcoholism is neoliberalism, like late capitalism causes depression, like those takes all the time. But eating disorders never get that type of structural context. Instead, it's always this like very individualized issue where all the books I could find were either just pure memoirs or self-help books mainly, or like medical tomes. And all of those stories sort of put a lot of impetus on the individual to both like sort of find recovery within themselves and also follow one very linear trajectory that just wasn't true for me or any woman I know that's had an eating disorder. And also I just felt like it was so blame laden, and I wanted to sort of, I was like, wait, I think there have been enough books written about hysteria. Like, I want to write a book that tells people with eating disorders, actually, this is not your fault at all. You've been a pawn to a wide array of structures, and let's sort of deconstruct them and figure out how we got here, because this definitely isn't your fault. And also, I feel like a lot of the times with narratives of eating disorders, it's like this idea like girls are so crazy, teenage girls are so crazy and vain or whatever. And like, we have feminism, so why are they still so obsessed with being thin? Like, they're overvaluing thinness. And it's like, no, teenage girls are sort of the smartest girls around. They're simply reading a room they've been locked into and developing a coping mechanism that is also a disease in order to like ease their motion through the world. And that is not their fault, even though it is ultimately, I wanted to sort of be like, ultimately, I think it feels like a mechanism of control, but it's actually entrenching a lot of the power structures that you're navigating, but you're actually making it worse, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that your own kind of eating habits, or it developed around the age of 12. I want to talk about, and maybe in your research, you figured out like why that specific point of like preteen, like young girls going through puberty.
Yes.
Like, what about that time in someone's life is like the perfect storm to create an eating disorder?
Well, it's really such a perfect storm. It's a horrible hurricane. I mean, on one level, you have like that sort of like early teenagehood is often like the first time you're becoming really like media literate, Today it's like TikTok, whatever. In our era, it was like, Tumblr and like all the, Us Weekly magazines, everything, where it was like, you're being surrounded by images of like incredibly thin women who are being validated for being incredibly thin in the form of like attention and affection, whether it's like, and these women are being forced to like walk such a fine line where as soon as they get we want them to be almost sick looking, but not actually sick looking. And so you're being bombarded at all sides with like images of incredibly thin women being valorized for that thinness, or being demonized for being sick, but they're still like on the cover of the magazine and everyone's so worried and getting all the attention. And often that era can be a time when it's really hard socially, right? And so a lot of teenage girls really struggle in middle and high school with social dynamics. And if you feel lonely and you feel like you're not getting the attention you want, it can feel like one of the only ways to exert control over the type of attention you're getting, because you can't control other people. And I know that was a big part of my experience. So there's the social layer, and then there's also often like your body is physically changing. It's puberty. So your body feels out of your control, right? And you want to have agency in that process, and it's ultimately you can't. And one of the things I am so obsessed with about you is all the work you're doing around sex education, but we have so little sex education in this country. And so like you feel gross and weird, right? And nobody's telling you that it's normal, and nobody's telling you that you should feel uneasy or whatever it is. And so you feel like you're supposed to be handling this with some sort of grace. And so often it can just feel like the easiest way to snatch back some of the agency, both over the way your body's physically changing and the way it's being received. It's often the first time like you are or are not getting attention from boys, like
from other girls,
like wanting to
fit in. You're like wearing the same thing. Like it's such an interesting microcosm or time of just like a woman's life.
Yes. And then it can be this like very like, I was really interested in the book. I like really tried to weave kind of like a choral narrative and write from this place of like we, both because I think that like solidarity and empathy are like the only ways we can ever like deconstruct the tyranny of the thin ideal, but also because there's this very fascinating and delicate and dangerous, but also in another way very moving, like kind of sororal sorrow thing I found about eating disorders, especially in that age where you're kind of often like doing it with your friends and you're sort of like trading tips and tricks, whether it's with people on the internet that are anonymous or like your actual friends, or you're like, guarding the bathroom stall or whatever. And it's sort of this like supportive self-harm environment that I really wanted to kind of analyze I feel like that tension between supporting each other and helping each other hurt ourselves is something that is part of why teenage girls have been the center of so many moral panics in our society and are often so demonized and cast as like vectors of illness or like vain girls getting each other sick, indoctrinating each other, whatever. And it's like, no, that's not what's happening at all. We're all being fed like diet culture from literally all sides, and we want to ease each other's motions through the world. And so I wanted to both sort of like flip the lens and show the ways that like things that have been really demonized that girls do together were actually, even though yes, they were harmful, and I'm not saying that anyone should be like trading their diet tips, like it was out of an impulse to care for your friend and you want her life to be easier, right? And you're being told that the way to make your life easier is to be thin. And so I wanted to kind of describe that, but be like, what if we did something entirely different?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of trading the diet tips, we talked about where we first read about a diet, or we first thought that being thin was a good idea, or who's our like thinspo icon and did her life actually end well? And sort of like, what if we can take these conversations in a different direction, but begin them in that same kind of emotional place of just like, I just wanted to kind of, I feel like I wanted to like fight for girls that have been made to look really mean and crazy and be like, it's not as toxic as it looks, or even if it is, it's coming from a place of care.
Yeah, which I love because it's kind of hearing someone's story firsthand is like the first step in being able to empathize with someone.
Completely.
Well, first, I feel like you have to sympathize and then you imagine yourself in their shoes. And I feel like as a society as a whole, we've kind of lost that.
Completely.
I don't know why this popped into my head, but the movie 13.
Oh my God.
Like, so random, but I mean, not random.
No.
It's like totally
Yeah.
fitting, but it's like, you know, they're like out on the town and they're like fucking boys and they're getting their tongue pierced and she's like this toxic, crazy,
Yes,
like
yes.
13-year-old. And it's like so interesting to almost even take that film and it's like, it could be told in a very different way with the same exact dynamics or girls,
Completely.
quote unquote, and like, it's a time of raging hormones and like your emotions and you don't know how to handle them. And it's like, what's really going on behind the surface?
Completely. And I feel like there are so many films that you actually can just like reinterpret them, right? Even it's like the exact same film. So like one that I was really obsessed with doing that with in this book was Jennifer's Body.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like at the time everyone was like, oh, it's so like, it got like totally misunderstood in the press and horrible reviews. And I mean, it was called pulpy, et cetera, et cetera. But I found it like really fascinating because you can read that movie as a real tale of like that type of sisterly, sororal, like self-harm as a coping mechanism to get through. Like Amanda Seyfried basically like mercy kills her best friend at the end, right? Because like, and that can be a metaphor for the way we've made society completely unlivable for women unless you're doing something really bad, like being a cannibal or having a fucking eating disorder, you know what I mean? And I feel like 13 is great. I feel like the OC, there's so many Gossip Girl.
That period of time,
Yeah.
though, like I almost feel like we're like a little bit on the young side.
Yeah.
Like my brothers are 35 and 37, and I'm like those really like early 2000s, like TMZ, Daily Mail, like that. It's just like the magazines, like, and you could also never win. You're either like too thin or you're not thin enough.
Exactly. You could literally never win.
You're being demonized either
way. And so like a figure that I was obsessed with being like, no, she was cast as this like toxic villain, but literally we trapped her. What was she supposed to do from that era was Nicole Richie, right? Because she was on The Simple Life with Paris and is being called fat in all the tabloids. Everyone's like, she's not quite as skinny as Paris. So like disgusting, cruel insults on the cover of magazines. She very visibly in the public eye develops an eating disorder. And then she's getting put on the cover of Vanity Fair with the literal headline was Nicole weighs in. And like the intro of the article was like, is she anorexic? Is she not? She says she's not, whatever. And they're like, and then she's being cast as this bad influence on young girls. But it's like, you didn't put her on the cover of your magazine until she lost an extreme amount of weight, right? And then I was really interested in both kind of showing that these starlets have been misunderstood, but also the girls that looked up to them, right? So you had the whole like pro Anna Tumblr verse that was like obsessed with Nicole Richie, right? But they were also obsessed with like like the pro-Anna Tumblr verse was very like
Ballerinas in literal Russia.
yes, literally. But also, like, they would post, you know, like the inspiration images. They would also post diets, right? But oftentimes they'd be pulling an image literally that was on the cover of Us Weekly, that was in the Daily Mail, or that was in Vogue, and put it alongside a diet that was also published in those publications. And then the way that those spaces were covered in the media by like the New York Times, the Atlantic, et cetera, they're calling them like dark spaces of illness. They're calling the girls cults of like suicide cults, acting like girls are actively out here trying to like indoctrinate each other into this like dangerous cult of illness. And it's like, okay, let me get this straight.
Yeah.
When a 12-year-old girl posts the same diet and the same image that you guys just posted, and yes, maybe she's using some like fucked up terms like thinspiration or reverse-spiration, but like how she went from reverse spo to thin spo is not actually that different than what Us Weekly said, which is how she lost the weight in 10 days. You know what I mean? And with the stroke of her laptop keys, suddenly information that was not dangerous when literally 40 different middle-aged men signed off on it in different high-rise buildings in this city that we're in right now is suddenly extremely dangerous. And I was trying to demonstrate that like part of this impulse to demonize teen girls for just like literally, as I said, reading the room they're locked into is in service of upholding this artificial binary between a healthy diet and an eating disorder that just ultimately doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And when you put the diets that are on these boards next to the diets that are published, you see that it doesn't exist, but they don't want us to see that. And then also none of that coverage would talk about the other parts of those online spaces where people were like literally just on message boards helping each other get through the day. And like I talked to people in my interview process that were like, I literally only am alive today because like somebody that I didn't know in real life, like I sent a goodbye message to before I tried to kill myself. And then that person like called help to my house. Like these were really, really helpful life-saving spaces for a lot of people, especially because it's very hard to get an eating disorder diagnosis. So often you can't get treatment and then you can find solace in these spaces. And then in like 2014, all of these spaces were censored by Tumblr because of this moral panic. And a lot of people lost their like one lifeline. And it was just, I really
like
wanted to sort of
like everything.
yeah.
They all got kind of wiped.
Yeah. And
away.
I just kind of wanted to write like an elegy / a recontextualization of these spaces. And I like to just loop it back to Nicole Richie. Like I felt like she was a really good way into that because do you remember that Memorial Day barbecue scandal? Okay,
Tell us.
This is all about me being 1 year older than you. So in, I believe it was 2007, an amazing year for women. She, right after this whole scandal where everyone was like, is she anorexic? Is she not? After calling her fat. She threw this Memorial Day barbecue party and like the invite got leaked and it was basically like, start starving yourselves now, girlies. No one under 100 pounds will be allowed in. And so then she got totally destroyed in the media. Like she's trying to give people eating disorders. And it's like, it was the exact same thing that was happening on these spaces. I was like,
yes, I do.
I was like,
remember
no,
that.
she's just like literally being funny. Like this can be understood as like protest humor. She's literally like, okay, you guys told me to lose tons of weight in a tiny amount of time. The only way to do that is an eating disorder. No one under 100 pounds was allowed on the fucking cover of Vanity Fair. Like I wasn't put on there until then. Like why are we demonizing her rather than the media
System.
establishment? Yeah, that like made her do that.
It's really fascinating to think about like the people who did sit on the heads of those magazines back in the day. And if you were, you know, and a lot of them like have kids, have grandkids.
Yeah.
If you were to go to talk to like, let's say the editor-in-chief of like OK Magazine in
Yeah,
2002.
I'm like, I really wonder how you sleep at night.
Yeah, or I'm like, maybe you just compartmentalize.
You must.
Or,
I mean, I
like,
have no idea.
You're just like, this is what sells. Like, I feel like they're just looking at the numbers at that point.
I mean, definitely. But then it's also like a big part of like my kind of read on the culture is like, yes, how does the person that published like, you know, those incredibly overt, cruel, like upholding of the thin ideal things of being like, she's literally fat, like top 10 ugliest celebrities, whatever it is,
Totally.
sleep at night.
Victoria's Secret.
Right. Then I'm like, that's actually not that different than like being Anna Wintour or like being the editor of the New York Times that published all of those really cruel articles about teenage girls that like spoke to journalists and were really, really misunderstood. When I was talking to girls on like current era in pro eating disorder spaces, a lot of them were really reticent to talk to me. And same with like people my age that had been on the Tumblrverse because they were like, well, I've talked to journalists before who lied to me and who said they were going to like do this space that saved my life justice and like, yes, point out the ways that it was self-harming and bad, but that also wasn't going to make us look like we were trying to get people sick. And instead just like literally cast them as insane people. And I'm like, they're the sanest people around. They're just trying to figure out a way to live up to the standards that have been bombarding them their entire lives. And the other thing is like that whole pro-Anna era Tumblrverse was so demonized, but a lot of those spaces you had to really search to figure it out. Like you had to know the right terms to find it. Often these spaces had moderators. There have been like sociological studies that I read for my book showing that like you were usually sick for like 3 years before you found them. Like it wasn't like healthy people getting sick from that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas today we have TikTok where like people are being fed really highly pro-disordered eating, in my opinion, like what I eat in a day is, etc. when they're not even searching for it, right? And that isn't being covered as dangerous at all, right? Or like nobody's being like TikTok's indoctrinating people into a cult of thinness when they literally are. There was this one experiment that was carried out that was like if you code a bot as a 13-year-old girl and she doesn't even type anything, no like tags in, and just like downloads a For You page and all it knows about you is that you're a 13-year-old girl, it starts feeding you things with the tags like skinny and like the what I eat in a days. And if you just don't scroll past fast enough, you're really, and like you watch the video, or if you watch the video twice or whatever, you very quickly start getting things called, there was those, in the span of like, I think it was like 4 days, the bot girl was getting something called the corpse bride diet, right? And she hadn't even searched for anything. So it just really demonstrates, it's very emblematic to me of the way like we use teenage girls as a scapegoat to pretend that they're like inventing this beauty standard when in fact they're just trying to survive it.
Well, also as an experiment almost. I'm like specifically with like AI generated content.
Yeah.
Which is like the next wave.
It's
I mean,
totally
we're like
scary.
in it now,
Yeah.
but it's like really just the beginning.
Yeah.
And I just think like, oh my God, imagine us 12 and 13. Imagine being 12 or 13 today.
It's terrifying.
Like being inundated with that information
constantly. And you can't, there's no like there's no sieve, there's no filter. Like you don't have to seek it out at all. It's just like there, and it's like coded to be addictive in like a way that like the sort of Tumblr thing was just so different.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very anti, like, I feel like my kids will not have social media.
Oh, I'm like,
At least until a certain age.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like until 16. I read this really interesting study that was like, if you obviously can't be the only person to not give your child a phone in like class because of social constructs, then you're like setting your kid up to be bullied.
Yeah.
But to not have social media, I think it was like up until the age of 15 or 16, like if you can do that, like just even their development of their self-esteem.
No, completely. I also read a terrifying article that was about how like all these tech CEOs in sort of Silicon Valley area send all their kids to this school that's like completely Wi-Fi-less, tech-free, whatever. Like they're like the people that are building this software are not letting their kids have it until they're like 14.
It's so,
it's so
fucked up.
Evil.
It's honestly, it reminds me a bit of, I read this really amazing book on gambling.
Oh, yeah.
And how they've designed Las Vegas and casinos, and it's like they'll literally hire neuroscientists to like, how can we make it
and they do it with everything, like with the lighting.
Oh yeah, it's the lighting so that it never looks like daylight, so you don't know what time it is. It could be like 1 p.m. and sunny outside, but it like seems like it's like 10 p.m.
Yeah.
And they lower like the chandeliers right over the tables so it feels very like cozy, free alcohol's flowing, so you're less inhibited, so you spend more money, like all of these things at play.
And you know what? That's like honestly like a really good metaphor for diet culture, you know? Like which I also think itself is like a horrible term that like serves to uphold the thin ideal, because again, it's still like implying that there's a difference between a diet and an eating disorder when like a third of diets become pathological and like that's an undercount, etc. But like we wouldn't call rape culture catcall culture, and I feel like that's what calling a culture of eating disorders diet culture is. But it's exactly what you're talking about, right? Because you know the alcohol is flowing, the lighting, like whatever, that's sort of like the high and the attention that you get when you're like losing weight, and the way the world receives you in that moment when you're actually doing something that is so bad for you, just like gambling. Whether you're losing money, you're losing weight, or you're getting so much attention and what feels like affection when you're doing just these extraordinary amounts of self-harm.
Yeah. And I feel like that doesn't get enough attention.
Yeah, and
Like,
it's
people don't even acknowledge the fact of that, like, majority, I mean, men too, obviously, but like women, specifically young women, are a victim to the entire system.
No.
And it's exactly what you
Completely,
write
yeah.
about. It's not the individual.
Yes, and it's like I think a lot of our like medical part of the reason. So eating disorders have some of the like the treatment has like the highest relapse rates of like any mental illness treatment. It doesn't work, and that's largely because the treatment is this highly individual form of treatment, right? That's trying to teach you like your eating disorder is a false consciousness in your head, and it's telling you that thinness is more important than it is. So you have to like do these like CBT exercises to like teach yourself that like you're overvaluing thinness. And it's like that is ultimately kind of gonna go ahead and feel like gaslighting for a lot of women that are like living in society. And what if instead we were saying, okay, no, you're not overvaluing thinness. This entire society is overvaluing thinness because a billion different corporations are making tons of money off of diet plans, off of eating disorder treatment, off of fashion magazines, off of all of this stuff. And there's racism in the beauty standards, there's misogyny in the beauty standards, like there's so many things going on, and you are being used as a pawn. And so actually what I find to be more helpful to say to someone suffering, and what I found to be helpful in my recovery, which was only possible through a lot of self-education on the history of these issues, is to be like, okay, no, so every time, so this wasn't my fault, and I don't have to like shame or blame myself for like upholding a beauty standard that I don't believe in politically, you know? I was just trying to survive, but I don't want every other woman I know to keep doing this, because I know how much it hurts, and I've seen so many other women in pain. And anytime I do like a disordered eating behavior and pretend it's fine, then like I'm teaching my younger cousin that wasn't self-harm, you know? And so kind of that type of conversation that's way more structural and way less blame-laden is so much more helpful. Like all the people I spoke to in interviews were like, my eating disorder treatment had no like political education, no context, just these like very individual, like kind of like, we have to teach you to be less crazy things, you know? And like all of that other stuff could have been helpful.
It's interesting because, like, obviously I did a treatment not for eating disorders, but I did a treatment for like personality
Yeah.
disorders and stuff at McLean. And so much of it was this psychoeducation. And it's because they've done studies that, like, to recover from anxiety, depression, the more you know about just even like the brain chemistry, what's causing it, social issues, how you're raised in the family unit, your what's the word, attachment, like knowing those things helps you have more agency
Yes,
to
yes.
really get better.
And that's like exactly what I feel like the like political education and like around eating disorders can do. Like it was so empowering to me to be like, okay, no, I actually, and like honestly, in the throes of an eating disorder, I didn't have like the self-love or like the will to live to like want to do it for myself. You know what I mean? But I can motivate myself out of like, there's this Elizabeth Hardwick quote I love that is where she said that like the only two reasons to write are desperation and revenge. And I kind of felt like that both about writing this book, but also about recovery. Like, I'm like, I want to get revenge on this culture that has killed so many women and hurt so many women and upheld only this one story about both one beauty ideal and one sickness narrative. Like the narrative of like the thin white girl who's sort of like too good of a girl and has to learn and also this body dysmorphia narrative, right? That's like, she has to realize that she's not as fat as she thought she was, like the Lifetime movie, looking in the mirror and seeing a fat girl when you're thin. Like that's an actually incredibly fat phobic narrative that actually upholds the thin ideal, because you're saying, and they uphold this in treatment. There's this insane activity that they do where you like, it's called body tracing, and you literally like draw a picture of what you think your body is, and then you like lie down on top of it, and another girl like traces your actual body, and then you get up and you like look at it and you're like, oh my God, I'm smaller than I thought, which just implies that you shouldn't have been allowed to recover if you were in the size that you thought. And that itself is just upholding the logic of your eating disorder, right? And so if instead we say, why would it be so horrible to live in that body? Who taught me that? And what racist, misogynistic standards is it upholding? And what companies are making money off of it? I think it can be way more empowering, and you can snatch that agency back and be like, I actually like, once I see the machine that I've been a
I don't
cog
want to be
of,
a part of
I
it.
can be the cog that doesn't turn.
100%. Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. I mean, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about, because you've done a bunch of different programs, and kind of walk me through those experiences. I have never done an ED program, but I was in treatment with a lot of women who had been in them.
Mhm.
And something that I learned, which really bothered me to this day, is that like when you are, well, one, I know you talk about this in your book, like having to almost weigh a certain amount to
It-
get a diagnosis,
yes,
which we'll
yes,
discuss. And then also people who enter more of like the hospital setting when you're like severely emaciated. It's more about just getting you to the goal weight to discharge,
Mhm.
because like your insurance doesn't want to pay
Yeah.
for it. So I would hear about it, people like literally not even doing therapy, and they're just focused on like literally force feeding
No,
you.
it's insane. Yeah.
To get you out of the hospital. And then it's like just becomes the cycle, because you make the weight to discharge from the hospital. You've never treated the actual like issue
Mhm.
of what's going
Mhm.
on. And then ultimately, if they get out, they relapse, then they're back in the hospital.
Yes,
Like
yes.
to me, it was
It's-
like you
no.
wouldn't do that with addiction. You wouldn't do that with like
It's
all
eating
these other
disorders are the
things.
only, so eating disorders are the only mental illness in the DSM, the Psychiatry's Classificatory Encyclopedia. I know you know that, but whatever. Eating disorders are the only mental illness class that have a biometric marker, right? So like you would never need to like get an MRI to get a depression diagnosis or whatever. But in order to get an anorexia diagnosis, you have to hit a certain low weight. And like for bulimia, sometimes they'll make you test your electrolyte levels to like see how many times a day you're throwing up. And so in the first place, you have an extraordinarily exclusionary diagnostic paradigm that means that you're often telling people who have a disease defined by the fear of not being thin enough that they're not thin enough to deserve care. And so if you have all the cognitive, behavioral, and like emotional symptoms of eating disorders, of anorexia, but you don't hit the weight cutoff, which is what happened to me, you get something called eating disorder not otherwise specified. And it's basically this like really invalidating diagnosis that's basically like you're not good at your eating disorder, and insurance often won't pay for treatment. So like if you are like, I was lucky enough that my parents could pay for it, so they paid for it, but like the insurance wouldn't have paid for it. And you basically so you first of all have that, which a lot of people's bodies cannot ever get to the anorexic weight cutoff. And so you have tons of people who just never get help because they can never hit that cutoff. And a lot of people get the diagnosis I got and then get a lot sicker, which had happened to me even though I was getting care, because you feel in the treatment center like so minimized compared to the anorexics, because there's this like weird hierarchy, right? And so everyone's in this weird competition. And also there's a lot of like censorship happening in these treatment centers and siloing, where like the anorexics and the bulimics and the ednos people are all separated, and your speech is very censored. You're not supposed to talk about things that would trigger each other. And it's like, this should be the one space where we should all be talking about this. And also there's so much crossover. Like most people that suffer from anorexia end up suffering from bulimia or binge eating disorder later, because your body craves a binge after any starvation period. And yet those diagnoses are way more shame-laden and coded as like, greedy and impulse control and whatever, whereas anorexia is control, when in fact, like most people have both at one time or another, and aren't being allowed to talk to each other about the ways in which both coping mechanisms developed out of the same desire to fit the same beauty ideal and be unable to figure out how to do that, and it manifested physically differently, right? But so let's say you manage to get an anorexia diagnosis. Then you go into the treatment center and you're going to get kicked out by your insurance. All your insurance cares about is you hitting what they define as your healthy weight, which is defined by BMI, which is itself a racist and misogynistic standard, but it's what they use. And so then you're in this treatment center where, in my opinion, you would think that an eating disorder treatment center would teach you sort of how to eat in the context of your own life, and how to eat without it being the centerpiece of your day and the main thing in your mind. And also how to eat in a way that's not really numerically focused, right? Because a lot of these eating disorders, you're thinking about calories and you're thinking about weights and all this stuff. And instead, you're in this insane surveillance state that's super numbers focused, because you're getting weighed every morning, even if they don't show you your weight, and you're turned around and you see this steady drip of girls that get kicked out the day they hit the goal weight. So if you're still there, you haven't gained that much weight. And then you're eating in this incredibly theatrical and regimented way at these appointed times and these like weird plates of specific foods. And then once you hit the weight that your insurance deemed healthy, you're kicked out right at the moment where you're now in the body that you were just almost killing yourself to not be in, right? So that's actually the time when you need holistic psychiatric care the most.
Yeah.
That's when you should stay in for 2 more weeks and just have therapy all the time. But instead, they kick you out. And then when you relapse, unlike with addiction and with any other form of treatment, instead of the treatment being understood to have failed, you're understood to have failed treatment. And so then your insurance will pay for less of it next time. And like people end up in these huge cycles of debt. And like I talk to people whose parents like mortgaged their homes because you're just going in and out of these treatment centers. And eating disorder treatment and addiction treatment, which both have the 2 like highest relapse rates of any forms of treatment, are also the 2 most expensive forms of treatment in this country. And so it does sort of, for me, beg the question of like, well, yeah, these corporations don't really have an incentive to develop a treatment that works because they have these customers cycling through and paying $30,000 a month. Like, why would they change anything? So it's really dark. Sorry, that got really dark.
No, but I think it's so important to highlight because, again, like now we can discuss, like, okay, in a perfect world, what could we do better or what could be done to actually help people, which is almost like one step of it is forming the sense of community, people being brave enough to talk about their actual
Yes,
stories,
totally.
coming out and really talking about the nitty gritty. And it is like shame. I don't know if you felt a lot of shame with your journey personally, but I'm like, even with my mental health stuff, like I feel shame all the time.
No, completely same. And I think it's like, I completely agree with you. Like there's so much shame around it. And specifically like with eating disorders, because the dominant narrative is just this like highly individualized, like, why couldn't she just not take the thinness so seriously? Like, don't we have feminism these days? Like, why are girls still so crazy? Like, narrative. There's so much shame around it because you feel like it's your fault and you couldn't just like figure out how to
It keeps
not
people sick.
not take in the diet culture messages. Why couldn't you be a strong enough feminist or whatever? And then also there's the other side of it where like because of these exclusionary diagnostic paradigms and because we're so obsessed with separating like a clinical eating disorder from just like the disordered eating that pretty much every woman I've ever spoken to has done, it makes you also, I think a lot of people feel like they can't talk about it because they were like, oh, well, I'm not as sick as that person. And like, I think that for me, it's important to talk about like I never had an anorexia diagnosis and it still was like the central force of my entire life, right? Even though I was never considered that sick by the medical industry. But I think that once you start talking to people about it and like if you open up first and say something, like that, that's kind of like something that might feel shameful. Often like the responses I get from other women will just be like, oh my God, completely same, like just like even just like asking like any one of your friends, like, so what has like consuming food meant to you in relation to how your body is received by society starts such a fascinating conversation. You don't even have to use the word eating disorder because it's like we live in a literal fucking like amorphous atmosphere of disordered eating. So we don't even need to say it. You know what I mean? It's just like everywhere. And I think it can sometimes be easier to get into talking about it if you don't start with the specific words, because they're so shame-laden unfairly and because we're so resistant to like understanding a disease that primarily, like I think because it primarily afflicts young women as a structural issue.
Do you think there's just a lack of research on eating disorders?
Yes, there definitely is. I mean, there is like a National Institute of Mental Health report that literally called it the mental illness class with the burden most discrepant to like funding most discrepant to burden of illness because eating disorders are incredibly prevalent and highly lethal. Over 10,000 people die of eating disorders in this country every year.
I remember
like
reading
it's
that in your thing, like compare it
there's
to opioids.
Yeah. They're the second most fatal mental illness after opioid addiction, and they only became second in like 2014 when opioid addiction was really at its peak, and so or was continuing to be on the up and up as it unfortunately is.
Yeah.
But so like there's no other disease that is killing so many people and is so widely prevalent that we do so little research into and that we like don't talk about how there's no treatment for. Like, you see the opioid epidemic is on the front page of newspapers every day, and you see so much less coverage of the eating disorder epidemic. And I really think it's because we as a culture don't want to face the fact that like the only way to address this epidemic is to address our beauty standards, address our culture of dieting, like address the like racial capitalism that created all of this. And the publications that would have to report on it are part of it. And so not even that it's like a grand conspiracy, but it just like is this like whirlpool that's been going on for so long. And we've developed this culture of silence around it by upholding this one highly individualized narrative where if we want to believe that like an eating disorder is a problem of body dysmorphia and of thinking you're fat when you're not, and therefore learning that you actually aren't as fat as you thought, and you can do some CBT exercises to remind yourself of that and to remember that thinness isn't the greatest thing ever, then you can like go on your merry way, which doesn't work for people as we're seeing in the death rates. But we need to believe that narrative, which is like literally as narrow as the beauty, as thin as the beauty ideal. Like that's the only narrative that can allow the system to keep chugging along. And so I really wanted to kind of with this book tell a far wider array of stories of showing, eating disorders show up in all types of bodies. And also like you can have 5 different eating disorders over the course of your life. In fact, most people do. And you can often recover at the time you least expect it because of one conversation you had with a friend, or because like you read one book that changes everything, or whatever it is.
Well, I think also it seems like these hospitals or these treatments think like, oh yeah, come do a 30-day program and it's like one and done and fix. And it's like actually it's a lifelong issue.
Yes.
Similar to how they view how we view addiction, or we view like, I don't know, personality disorder is like the example I use. I'm like, okay, I may not meet criteria anymore for like BPD and technically be like cured.
Totally.
But I'm like, no, I will always have it. And anytime I'm significantly stressed out, I need to watch out for having more symptoms that then I could easily meet criteria again. Like it's a lifelong struggle.
Completely. And it's the same with eating disorders. And then that's why so many people say, because once you're released out of treatment, you're released back into a world where you've been given no tools to eat, to consume food, so to basically endure the society that gave you the eating disorder without resorting to the coping mechanism of the eating disorder. You've only been taught to eat in a highly theatrical and regimented and surveilled way, surrounded by other people with eating disorders eating in that exact way. You haven't been taught to like assemble a plate of food or to like try to not think about it all day, right? Like imagine an eating disorder treatment center where the goal was like, what if actually like none of these girls thought about food all day long and just ate when they were hungry, and it didn't matter if it was like whatever. And
like more like food freedom.
Yes, yeah, and like intuitive eating and all different types of things. But it's just like, so then you're released back out there. You have no tools, and you're in the very body that like you actually weren't inhabiting before.
Yeah.
So you were like, so it's like even scarier. And then we're surprised, and again, like demonizing and acting like it's an individual problem that somebody relapses. When of course, how could they not being basically told like, okay, you're not sick anymore, even though you feel just as sick as when you entered.
Mm-hmm. And what about also like to actually enter treatment, you have to be usually like sick enough or weigh a low enough weight to even enter. So it's like it's like they only wait until the point where like you're really struggling.
This is also another thing about like just proof of like how little we care about eating disorders and like the lives of people with eating disorders in this country, because there is, again, not enough research on eating disorders, but like the little research there is shows that like one of the very few things that correlates with like long-term remission of an eating disorder is getting treatment early on in the course of your illness. And yet we have set up the diagnostic paradigm to only allow for the exact reverse of that, and to only allow people to access treatment once their disease has gotten so bad that they can finally, be considered anorexic, when actually they had all of those emotional and cognitive and behavioral symptoms for literal years. They just like their body wasn't ill enough. And at the point that your body is that malnourished, that's when it becomes like really like rooted in your brain, and it becomes much more of like a brain chemistry, like really resistant to treatment thing. And so we're literally the entire system is designed to only allow you to get help at the point when it's really unlikely to work.
In your research, was there things you came across, like, because I feel like what we're talking about is like, okay, you're treating it
Mhm.
after the issue
Yeah.
is there versus prevention,
Yeah.
which I feel in addiction, just in like the health of this country and eh, like so many different things with food, whatever, that we don't put enough emphasis on preventing things from occurring, rather just
Com-
treating it once it's there.
Completely, because prevention doesn't make anyone any money and treatment is incredibly, incredibly profitable for a bunch of companies. But I think it actually is related to like the type of prevention you're talking about, and also the stuff we were talking about at the very beginning of this, of those like preteen years and teen years when you're also not getting sex education. Like imagine if like you had a class when you're in 7th grade that's both like sex ed and sort of like, hey, here's a real quick history of the beauty ideal. And like, here's a real quick primer that like 35% of diets become pathological, and like
We should do
we
this.
should do this. And like eating disorder, like anorexia has a full on 20% chronic or fatal rate, right? Like to like give young people the tools to know that what is being sold to them as a benign diet literally might kill them, and then they might not embark on it. Like I didn't have that information, you know?
Knowledge is power. And
Yeah.
I'm like, they could extend it to anxiety, depression, all of these things, just like at that pivotal time. And especially imagine if you're
Just like a
living,
literal mental health class.
yeah,
Like explaining what each of these
what
diseases
these
even
things
are.
and to look for signs. Because also, if you're coming from a household where, let's say, your mom is really struggling and that's viewed as normal
Yeah,
in your
yeah.
house, so this lens, and then you're coming to class, you don't, at 12, 13, you don't know anything different.
Completely.
And that's a big thing that I'm sure you talk to people in your book about, is like, yeah, what do you do if you're, see the rise of the almond mom on
Yes.
TikTok,
Oh
for
my God.
example.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
oh, my mom is actually like really struggles with an eating
Yes.
disorder or unhealthy eating patterns, and she's almost like put it on me.
Yes. I mean, eating disorders are so intergenerational. It's true because as a young girl, the first person you see eating and consuming and what you obviously would role model your behavior off of is your mother. And so this is like something that's related to also what we were talking about at the beginning of this like kind of sororal self-harm thing, right? Because like a big part of my goal in this book is to like, I feel like whenever we talk about eating disorders, we're either totally glamorizing them or completely demonizing the women who do it and being like, oh, that woman's a horrible role model for other women, right? And so I wanted to try to figure out a way to neither demonize nor glamorize, and like instead maybe go ahead and empathize for once in our fucking lives. And like, can we just blame anyone but ourselves for a change? And so it's like, like that almond mom believes that it's going to ease her daughter's path through the world to eat that way, right? And so she's coming at it from a place of love, but in fact, she's teaching her daughter a very dangerous thing. And if we had more conversations about this stuff, she might actually be able to realize that and realize she doesn't want to do that, right? But yeah, it's really hard. And I think that's why just like conversation and education are so important, because also our mothers' generations had even less information than we did. Like they didn't even name bulimia as a disease until 1979 was like the first time it was
And
like
also
quote
look
unquote
at the
invented.
media back then,
Yeah.
and the bodies you saw
Completely. It's
in
and,
advertisements.
yeah, and they had just like even less information.
Mhm.
And like until Karen Carpenter died of anorexia, it was basically no one knew what it was, and that was like the 80s.
I want to know your thoughts on Kim Kardashian at the Met Gala
Oh,
this
God.
year, because it was a couple days ago.
It was so scary. I mean, I only looked at it for like a second. I was like, I must look away.
Because she wore, obviously, like John Galliano made her Margiela, and he's like really, I guess, been into like corsets or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
And she wore this insanely small. I mean, it went viral everywhere. And she looks like she got like 15 ribs removed.
It's insane. I mean, even when
she couldn't walk and she couldn't breathe. I saw videos of her on the carpet, and she literally could not breathe.
It's insane. I mean, it was the same when she wore that Marilyn Monroe dress, and she was literally bragging on both her television show and in any magazine
How
that
she
would
had to
take her
train.
about, yeah, but she also talked about like literally cutting out like pretty much every food group. Like she went on like a severely extreme diet that was literally just like anorexic levels of restriction. But again, we're obsessed in this culture with pretending that like an extreme diet, what I eat in a day that features a total calorie amount that we would not recommend for an 8-year-old child, but an adult woman's eating it as like just like a healthy diet, as though that's different from an eating disorder. But okay, Kim Kardashian, so much to say.
Well, my main question
Yes.
is, we've been talking about people being a victim to this greater societal impact.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yes, on one hand, we can be like, is she probably personally also a victim to this? Yes. And then at what point do you, like, she's propelling those images and those beauty standards herself to 400 million people.
No, completely. And I find it very dangerous and disturbing for sure. But I also think it is important to then also think about, okay, well, actually, let's think about how Kim Kardashian was being treated by the media back when she was, or the media she was consuming when she was Paris Hilton's assistant, right? And she was watching Nicole Richie get this eating disorder and suddenly be on the covers of magazines. Like, she was raised in the same media environment, or like a slightly different one than us. Like, I understand why she's behaving this way, but I think it's very dangerous. And I think that when you have a platform like that, you do have to think about what you're promoting.
Mm-hmm.
And how many really young, impressionable girls are consuming your content and seeing a physically impossible ideal. And then also it becomes like, I feel like the beauty ideal every day becomes even more of like a terrifying Frankenstasia with the fact like they didn't used to be able to get a rib removed, or like
also it's just constantly changing. Their influence on the BBL era in 2015.
Well, I think that's part, like it's just worsening the eating disorder epidemic because it's impossible, because you also never know what's coming.
You can't
to me, like in the book, I try to do this like metaphorical thing of like tracking epidemiology of different eating disorders onto different economic moments. So like being like anorexia as this austerity, and like bulimia I see as kind of this like 2010s kind of like girl boss, like move fast and break things. It might even be my body, like kind of disruptor thing. And then I feel like now we're in this like terrifying combination orthorexia Ozempic era where it's like the techno-capitalist eating disorder, because the beauty standards change like as fast as the value of a fucking cryptocurrency, and you can't keep up. So we need all these like technological aids that are just worsening eating disorders and making them sort of happen at hyperspeed. And it's very, very scary.
At what point does she become the society? Like,
well,
I'm like trying to empathize and be like, okay, you're a victim of the same thing.
But no, I mean, with the Kim, I'm not like, at this point, I'm like,
and then she's selling us things to buy, like Skims, where I'm like,
no.
I will never, even if I put on a Skims, I'll never look like you because you have certain
completely. But I mean, like, even like I write about this in the book. I'm like, so even just like the title of Skims, solution wear, right? So that's you're instantly teaching young women that their body is a problem to be solved, right? Like, it's called a solution. So we're starting somewhere very dangerous in the first place. And I think like, I don't know, I feel like Kim is such a insane microcosm of so many of our cultural forces that at this point I don't even know if she has, not to deny women agency, but I'm like, is she like a fucking like capitalist AI robot? Like, I don't even know. Like, her and Ariana Grande, I'm like, I feel like these are holograms at this point that are like designed to sicken young women. It's really scary. But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I think you have to empathize if you can. Like, I think it's important to keep a sort of like empathetic, like solidarity forward mindset, but I don't think that precludes calling people out when they're seeding very dangerous messages into the culture and are, really promoting something that is only achievable for most people via extreme amounts of self-harm. Like, we have to be willing to call that out. And I think that's something that I tried to do also, like, kind of tonally with the book, in this way where like the book is about like women's appetites and the pain we endure suppressing them, but it's also about the way we talk about that, right? Which sometimes is, especially in our like internet era, this like kind of nihilism coded kind of, I call it like dissociation feminism, this thing that's sort of like, if you can't beat them, join them. Like, we tried body positivity and Kim is still on top, Ariana Grande is still on top, these people that are like insanely thin. So like, I'm going to, but I do know as like a smart young girl that beauty standard is politically indefensible, right? So then you have these like online Twitter girlies and like TikTok people sort of doing this kind of gallows humor thing that I feel like allows them to escape this double bind where they're trying to be like, I know this is a politically indefensible beauty standard, but I didn't create it. So if I can bring my body into closer alignment, like that's a slay for me.
Then
And
people treat me different.
yes, and I want to say, and so like what I want to say to those girls is like, and what I try to do in this book is like go back and forth, pivot in tone between like a scream, a sob, a super cringe core moment, and a super sarcastic moment. Cause I want to be like, I've had all those thoughts too, girls, but like I actually don't think that it's gonna feel as good as you think it is to make that joke when you're literally dying. And also when you're really teaching, when you're teaching other young girls to like try to slowly kill themselves, like trying to be beautiful in as a woman in this country like involves having like a weird death wish basically. Like it's really scary. And so I wanted to sort of and to bring it back to Kim, like I think that it's that she has, I think her sort of like glassy-eyed like filler face is like a kind of like aesthetic version of that dissociated nihilist thing, right? It's like no emotionless, like I have to numb out in order to embody this standard that requires so much self-harm. But also you can only, again, like not only is it nihilistic and harming yourself and others, it's also a highly privileged position that like only like a white woman can do because she's the only one who can bring her body into alignment with the culture. So once you realize that you're like kind of how much every disordered eating thing you do and promote is like really reinforcing both a beauty ideal that's toxic to people of all races, but that is also like again like reinforcing this idea that that the stereotypical thin white eating disorder patient who is like primacy in the eating disorder narrative is the reason that like Black women who suffer eating disorders at the same rates as white women like go undiagnosed en masse because they're just not they can't, their bodies often don't hit the weight cutoff even when you have all the same symptoms. So anyway, it's all just like a horrible octopus. And I just rambled a lot. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. And just like so many different ways we could take it or think about. I want to know just your personal thoughts on like I briefly mentioned like that the BBL culture.
Yeah.
Because I mean I've just read a lot of articles and seen it in the media of like people almost pursuing a different body type that maybe they also couldn't
yes.
get without surgery. And now it feels like it's going back to this, like our culture is slowly going back to with this Ozempic.
Yeah.
And like we're going back to like this thin white place.
Yes. It's really dark. I mean, it's kind of what we were talking about with like the beauty ideals changing so fast. Like the BBL body was all just as unattainable as the thin white beauty ideal. And it was also like only valorized when it like and getting the most praise and attention when it appeared on a woman that wasn't a woman of color, right? So it was horribly racist and a terrible moment in itself. And now we're in another terrible moment of this like return to the sort of traditional thin ideal. You even saw like articles last year that were like the return of heroin chic. And I'm like,
oh, I know, I saw that everywhere.
And I feel like that was also super interesting to me just in terms of like eating disorders and addiction. Like eating disorders and opioids are killing people in this country at such horrific rates. And we're literally coming up with a beauty standard that combines the two. Like what is wrong with us? And like, how can we not see that? And or like how I think it just really reveals to me how much we actually don't care if women die in this country.
Yeah.
But anyway, not to get so dark with it. But okay, so I think with the Ozempic stuff, it's extremely disturbing, and I think it just shows like honestly like that we like didn't ever come as far as we thought we did with like the whole body positivity moment. Like I think that there was like a lot of tokenism happening with that where there'd be like one or two plus size models that would be on the covers of things. And we were all like, yay, it's so amazing. But like, it was actually like, you know, eating disorder rates weren't changing. Like it wasn't like as great as we thought it was. But now it's sort of like, we're in this kind of terrifying like mask off moment with Ozempic where we're being like, no, actually like truly all we care about is being thin now that it's possible for more people to do it than ever before because we've never had such an effective drug, right? But the thing about Ozempic is that it's not actually acting on anybody's metabolism. What it does, I mean, it works in ways that scientists don't fully understand.
It slows your stomach down.
But yeah, it fully slows the digestion. So like if you eat a full meal, you feel really nauseous, right? So it's allowing people to eat at the levels of anorexic restriction without feeling super hungry. So it's just like, I think what's really scary to me is that like the obesity epidemic we've been taught to like fear, and that there's so much fear mongering around, is really not as dangerous as we think it is. Like, what happens with when people are fat, they often go on more diets and have eating disorders at higher rates than people that naturally have a thinner body, right? Because they're living in this highly fat phobic society that wants them to go on diets all the time. And so what diets do is they cause a lot of weight cycling. You gain the weight, you lose it, you gain the weight, you lose it. When most studies that are looking at obesity and overweight and fatness are funded by drug companies that are developing diet drugs. The few that aren't, that control for weight cycling. So have you been obese grade 1 your entire life? Have you been in the overweight band your entire life? Or has your BMI changed a lot? There's basically no change in mortality between somebody that is of an average weight and somebody that's classified as obese grade 1 if they've been that size their entire life. So what is genuinely dangerous is the weight cycling. That's really hard on your heart because your body doesn't understand like where to
I
pump
was gonna
blood to.
say heart disease is
Yes.
like real.
It is. It's
obviously.
completely real, but often there's no, I mean, we just can't know how much of fat people's poor health outcomes comes from the fat phobia of their doctors, who literally like diagnose cancer in later stages in fat people because the first prescription a fat person is ever given is a diet. How much of it is from dieting and the effects of weight cycling on their heart. Like, we just don't have research into that, so we can't really tell. All of which is just to say, fatness is probably not as dangerous as we think it is. Eating disorders are far more dangerous than we think they are. And I think with Ozempic, we are in our attempt to cure an epidemic that actually might not be as dangerous as we think it is, we're going to hugely exacerbate an epidemic of eating disorders that's much more dangerous than we traditionally think of it as. And I've been researching this now and like talking to people, and like there are tons of people that are fat people that have never been diagnosed with an eating disorder in their entire life because of the diagnostic paradigms we were talking about, who are like, oh, of course, I've always had an eating disorder. No one's ever diagnosed it. And now I'm on Ozempic and it feels like I am having a huge relapse because it's just allowing me to do my eating disorder. And then once they lose enough weight and they go off the Ozempic, then they gain the weight right back. You add another weight cycle that's really bad for your heart. And then you develop your eating disorder all over again. And it's just all of this
And
cyclical
in the
stuff.
fuck, you're also like, when you do lose the weight, we can't ignore that like you are going to get the gold star from society and people are going to pay more attention
Completely.
to you and X, Y, and Z.
Right. So like I would never shame someone for choosing Ozempic.
Totally.
But I'm like, I really worry that it's going to be really dangerous for a lot of people, both by like worsening their eating disorders and because we've just so little long-term studies. The longest study is like one just came out that was 5 years. Before that, the longest study was like 2 years. But the drug companies themselves say that if you go off it, you immediately gain the weight. So we're putting people on a drug that they're intended to take the rest of their lives, and we only know what it does for 5 years. We know that animals that take it their entire life have thyroid cancer right now. So like, it's very scary. And I also think that, to go back quickly to the like Ozempic as eating disorder of techno-capitalism thing, I feel like there's this movement in our culture with the filler face that's unmovable, and like the like just big tech of it all, of like DoorDash your food, never have to leave your house, get your at-home filler and not be able to move your face, and everyone's faces start looking more and more the same, and we're all on Ozempic. Like, it scares me. I feel like we're moving towards this like dystopian, like highly optimized, like don't feel hunger anymore. Take all your SSRIs, don't feel an emotion. And I'm like, are we all just gonna be these like fucking
like
boring ass robots that don't feel anything and all look the same? Like, that's so fucking boring. I want to live in a world where people like look different, and you can have a fucking meal with a friend that looks completely different than you and has a totally different mental illness than you, and you guys can actually feel your emotions together.
I will say though, I feel like we are in a unique microcosm living in New York City or LA, let's say, because like when I go to Seattle, for example, where I'm from, I'm like, I never see filler face, or like
that is true.
Like, I think we're
even like, I'm from DC and it's not the
like
same.
We live in like the two places where it is hyper like,
but also not to be so like New York, LA, bi-coastal elitist, but those are the two, like New York and LA are seeding the culture. So whatever's happening here is going to eventually 100%. Be seeping out everywhere. So I think it's important to like name it now in that like effort toward prevention.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, so many things. I feel like you could, like, we have book idea number 2 over here. Did you ever read Nancy Jo Sales' book?
Oh my God.
On the girls?
like have read part of it. I haven't finished it,
I
but
mean,
she's
talk about
insane.
demonizing
She's insane.
like little girls and their social media usage.
It's
and it's like it's like a 12-year-old's fault.
It's
It's
in this
insane.
culture, we're literally obsessed with making everything a 12-year-old's fault instead of like literally the many full-grown adults who are making so much money off of how much that 12-year-old girl hates herself. And like that's like the most important part of my project is being like, that 12-year-old girl is, first of all, not crazy. She's not stupid. She's actually literally a genius, and she actually like read the smoke signals, deciphered them, came up with a way to survive the evil culture. And now we're calling her crazy and like gaslighting her. And everyone's making so much money off of the magazines she bought, off of the treatment she's going to get that's not going to work, the hospital bills. Like it's horrifying.
Makeup,
Yeah,
like,
everything.
Skincare, like, yeah. I mean, it's just every single time I go on my phone, there's 50 things trying to sell me something.
Completely. My TikTok is
I'm a victim to it.
No, I'm such a victim.
I'm
I'm inches away from buying the TikTok teeth whitening device.
No.
I keep trying to stop. I have to stop myself every day.
I want to ask you like what's next for you and what you're working on.
Well, I'm working on a long like journalistic thing about the way that the sort of, you know, those places like Peachy and Plump that you can just like sort of get facial fillers in the same way that you would get like a manicure or a blowout. So the sort of dry barification of fillers, like the way that the ease of access and bookability and also just mainstreaming of it is changing kind of beauty standards for Gen Z.
Price point too is lower.
Yeah, and the price point,
places, yes, because they're not done by
yes.
a doctor.
Okay, yes.
MD.
So basically, I'm talking about like philosophically how it's changing beauty standards for those young girls, but also the way that it's so fucking dangerous for exactly the reason you just said. So at these chains, they only have to have like one doctor on the staff of like the whole chain who just has to be like on call in case the injector that has like 8 fucking weeks of training fucks it up. And like people have gone blind.
I was just gonna say, literally, I got Botox today around my eyes, and I always get nervous.
Yeah.
Like, you're not supposed to get filler in your nose because that also can like actually cause blindness.
No, literally. And there's so many things. And also, so because of the rise of filler and then the beauty standards changing as fast as we were discussing them changing, there's been a huge, just in the past few years, rise of filler dissolver. Have you heard about this at all? So it's like,
oh, that people go in to get it dissolved.
Yes,
but you know that it creates scar tissue. So like
Yes.
getting it truly dissolved is not.
But also on top of that, the chemical that they use to dissolve it is not approved for that purpose. And I've been talking to these women in these like support groups of like thousands of women who get these very strange autoimmune diseases triggered by that chemical because there's like no research into it. So basically, I'm very interested in the effects of the mainstreaming of facial fillers, both on our like beauty standards and also on our physical health. And it's tied into eating disorders, again, because of the way that, as I've been saying, we as a society just seem to really not care about like
health,
women's health. All we care about is the way women look and not whether we're fucking alive or not. So it's really depressing.
The thing of like you can never win.
Yes, you can never win.
Because it's like, okay, now you don't have big enough cheeks to match Kylie Jenner, so go get the filler. And now we're like, wait, they're dissolving their lips and they're dissolving their cheeks.
And now everyone's so mean to Kylie Jenner and is like, she looks horrible because she's aging with the filler, but like she was forced by this stupid society to get filler when she was like 17. Like it's so sad listening to her talk about how she's like it's both so sad and also honestly one of I'll do 2 notes of hope for that. Hearing her talk about her daughter and how she's like, having a daughter has changed everything for me. Like I would never, if she said she wanted to get her body done at age 16, I'd be heartbroken. And being able to have that realization because of the younger generation of women, I think is so cathartic and empowering. And I think is part of the amazing stuff you do on this podcast and just what talking about it does. Like realizing that we don't want the girls that are a little bit younger than us to feel quite as bad as we did. And actually we have some agency to help them not feel that way. And then to the earlier question that we were talking about of like what might work, I was having a long talk with a woman who had been through a million different types of eating disorder treatment that didn't work. And she was like, I once read this study about this Scandinavian form of treatment that sounded fabulous where you once a week go to a coffee shop with a friend and have a pastry and a coffee and talk about how eating has been for you that week and how you felt in your body. And then you go to the sauna. And it was like sounded like it would actually work. And I was like, that does sound like it should actually work. And she was like, I could never find it again. And then I scoured the internet for it and I couldn't find it. And I kind of think she dreamed it up, but I kind of think that's the most beautiful part. It's like literally how about we allow women to like be friends instead of in a constant beauty-based competition for attention and affection.
Yeah, and that like people can be open that like we're human and we're not perfect and like we live in a scary world and there's all of this mixed bag of emotions. So I think what you did and what you're doing is like I'm very courageous to like share your story in the way that you did. I mean, I'm a huge fan.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I feel the exact same way about you, Queen, and your honesty about like similar, like there's just so much shame around women and mental health and bodies and beauty. And I think we're just doing such a slay feminist job right now on this couch. It's really fabulous when two women can gab.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.